Good morning, everyone. Great to be with you this morning. We've got another great topic of discussion for you. I want to thank Perry Pigeon Hooks from Hooks Book Events and Mark Miguel from Wider Circle for sponsoring these programs with a purpose with Leadership Greater Washington. A great way to learn about some of the issues facing the country today and to talk to someone who's done an awful lot of research and writing about it. So Jessica Henry, welcome to you. Thank you very much for being here. I'll just add one thing on the no crime convictions in Baltimore. Gosh, it's probably 15 some years ago. The norm was to just arrest people walking down the street and put them in jail for the night. Never charge them with anything, but just so they could claim that they're reducing the murder rate. I mean, just a sort of an unbelievable trampling of people's rights. So I hope we talk about that a little bit too. Let me now turn it over to Mark Miguel from Wider Circle, and Mark's got a great new initiative going on a nationwide sort of initiative to end poverty. Mark?
Thanks, Doug. Kind of wish you hadn't said that because I don't really want to talk about that too much. I want to focus on Jessica. You know, this is Jessica's morning and her great research, but I appreciate that. You know, Wider Circle is obviously always excited to be a part of this. We are serving every day really hard. The staff is furnishing a dozen homes a day, even during the pandemic. So it's been really nice. And our national plan, you know, a transition to a new way of releasing that in January. So we're excited to do that. And obviously violence and safety are significant parts of poverty, and people in poverty are often marginalized and exploited through the discussions of issues like this. So excited to be a part of this. And Jessica, really looking forward to your presentation. I know you'll have about a 30-minute presentation, and then Perry will lead the Q&A. And so in fact, Perry, I'll just toss it to you to get the ball rolling.
Great. Thank you, Mark. Good morning, everybody. All our great friends out there got up early to hear this really interesting conversation. It's great pleasure for me to introduce my new friend, Jessica Henry. She's the author of the featured title, Smoke But No Fire, Convicting the Innocent of Crimes That Never Happened. Jessica was a public defender for nearly 10 years in New York City before joining the Department of Justice Studies at Montclair State University, where she is an associate professor. She is also a criminal justice expert, legal commentator, and blogger with a particular focus on wrongful convictions, police corruption and misconduct, mass incarceration, and the death penalty, all of which are obviously in the news right now. Please note too that the first 50 attendants will get a complimentary copy of her new book, Smoke But No Fire. And I also want to point out that Jessica is donating the proceeds from the sale of the book to the newly exonerated as they get out of jail. So we're even more happy to be able to give you all the book and support her with her first book just recently published. Jessica, welcome to Leadership Greater Washington, a Wider Circle and Hooks Book Events Programs with a Purpose. Looking forward.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, and good morning, everybody. I hope you are enjoying a nice cup of coffee while we start this conversation. And again, thanks for coming. So I think I'd like to start the talk with the same way that I start the book, and that is with the story of Rodriguez Crawford. It's a story that every time I tell it just makes me so upset because it's, as you'll hear, just an astonishing range of events, but it really illustrates what a no crime wrongful conviction is. So Rodriguez Crawford was a 19-year-old African-American young man. He lived in a poor part of Shreveport, Louisiana with his family. By all accounts, a really lovely person. He loved to dance, and he adored his one-year-old son. And one morning, the unthinkable happened. He woke up, and his child was lifeless in the bed next to him. The family called 911, and right from the outset of that phone call, things went incredibly wrong. So the dispatch, as we hear later in recordings, is making terrible, disparaging remarks about the family as she's telling the ambulance to head on over there. And the paramedics, when they arrive, start referring to the home as a crime scene. And they take the baby from the home and lock his body in the ambulance and call the police while the family's clustered around waiting to hear whether anything can be done to save this child's life. And finally, when they come out and tell the family that the baby in fact has died, the police treat Mr. Crawford as a criminal and whisk him off to the precinct for questioning rather than treating him as a grieving father. And the medical examiner proclaims that it's a homicide even before the lab results come back. And when the lab results come back and show that there is sepsis and pneumonia in this baby's lungs, the medical examiner dismisses it as incidental and insists that this child died of homicide by smothering. Things just take a turn for the worse even further. Mr. Crawford's case is assigned to a DA, Dale Cox, and Dale Cox is renowned in Louisiana as a hanging DA, and he has, often and in the public eye expressed his love for capital punishment, and he in fact seeks the death penalty for Rodriguez Crawford, who then is convicted and sentenced to Louisiana's death row. Eventually, Mr. Crawford is exonerated because the baby in fact died from pneumonia and sepsis and was never harmed by Mr. Crawford. But Mr. Crawford spent years on Angola's death row, all for a crime that never happened in the first place. And here we see how poverty and racism and a rush to judgment and the way that that rush to judgment resulted in cognitive biases that were passed along between the paramedic to the medical examiner to the police that investigated the case to the prosecutor. We see that the judge did nothing to sort of slow down these quick wheels of justice that led to this wrongful conviction. Now, many of you, I'm sure, have heard about wrongful convictions because wrongful convictions are in the media a lot today, which is a good thing. We're creating a lot of awareness around this issue, but many of you probably think of a wrongful conviction as a crime that actually occurred and the wrong person is convicted of that crime. And here you may have listened to the story of Adnan Syed in Serial, or maybe watched the movie Just Mercy or read the book, or even seen all the documentary films about Picking Cotton, where there was a woman was raped and she identified the wrong perpetrator. But what if I told you that one third of all known exonerations involve innocent people convicted of crimes that never happened in the first place? And that's what this talk is about. People who are wrongly convicted of crimes that just didn't happen. And so today what we're going to be doing in the course of this half an hour is I want to just briefly walk you through some of the data about innocence and about no crime wrongful convictions. I want to talk a little bit about how no crime convictions even happen in the first place, brainstorm a little bit about what we can do about them, and then open it up for questions and hopefully a really productive dialogue. And I'm looking forward to that part of this conversation. So let's just start really big picture, macro picture. How many innocent people are wrongly convicted? And the truth is we have no idea. We just don't know, because what we do, the little we know about is exonerations. Those are folks who've actually been identified as having been wrongly convicted. We don't know how many people have been wrongly convicted. One of the best estimates out there is by a scholar named Sam Gross, and he looked at death penalty cases. And he said about 4%, after doing all kinds of statistical analysis, he said about 4% of death cases, if they remained under a sentence of death, would result in an exoneration. And if that's right, and given that there are millions of people locked up in our jails and prisons in the United States, there are lots and lots of wrongful convictions that we just don't know about. And even if he's wrong, and the estimates do range from something like a low 1% to a high of 6 or 7%, even if we take that low estimate, we're still talking about thousands and thousands and thousands of people who are wrongly convicted. And then about a third of those would involve no crime cases. One of the best sources of data that we have is the National Registry of Exonerations. And you can go on over there. They've got a searchable database. As of last week, there were 2,667 exonerations. 986 of them are no crime exonerations. But their data is a little bit limited, right? They only collect exonerations since 1989, and they only include the cases that they actually know about, which again involve exonerations. So here we have exonerations kind of acting as a proxy for the number of wrongful convictions. But we know that's a clear undercount. One of the interesting things is just last week when I was updating my data, one of the most recent exonerations involves a no crime case. Frederick Earl Bain was wrongly accused and convicted of sexually abusing his 7-year-old daughter. What no one had actually learned was at the time of this accusation, the parents were involved in a bitter custody dispute, a bitter divorce, and the court had awarded Mr. Bain full custody. And it wasn't until that decision had been made that the mom was alone with the daughter at some point, and then the daughter came forward with this accusation. Took many years, but eventually Mr. Bain was exonerated after the girl insisted and recanted her testimony, but not until he had served 7 years in prison and time on Idaho's sex offender registry. So here's some more data just so that you can get a sense for how no crime wrongful convictions affect different components in the community. Out of all exonerations, no crime cases and actual crime cases, we see that about 49%, and that's this data over here, we see about 49% involve Black defendants and 36% involve white defendants, and about 11% are involve Hispanic defendants. Out of the no crime cases, we actually see a higher rate of white people pulled into the system, about 49% here, whereas Black people, about 39% of the defendants. And part of that has to do with the nature of the cases involved in no crime exonerations. So we see that there is an overrepresentation, a much more significant number of people who are white are exonerated in child sex abuse cases. And we see here that a much larger number of Black defendants are exonerated in possession and sale cases. And so some of the, when we look at the data, we have to consider both race and type of conviction. And then, of course, at the risk of stating the obvious, are there really only 986 no crime wrongful convictions? And the answer, of course, is no. That's just the tip of the no crime innocence iceberg. Again, it relies on the data from the National Registry of Exonerations, which is kind of the best source of data we have, but is incredibly limited, particularly in the no crime context. Why do I say particularly in the no crime context? Because it doesn't really include data about misdemeanors. And as I read about in my book, misdemeanors, which people often say, oh, that's just a petty offense, they really matter. But we have terrible information about how frequently no crime wrongful convictions occur in that context. And it obviously doesn't include cases where there's no exoneration, and we have very limited data about plea bargains. And so 986 is really just illustrative of a much larger and bigger problem. So let's talk about how these no crime wrongful convictions even happen in the first place. And part of it is the labeling of an event as a crime that triggers the whole system to kick in, right? Because if a crime was committed, then the police have to find the person who committed that crime. And once that person is identified as the suspect, then the whole system does what it does best, which is pursue a conviction and hold the perpetrator accountable. But when that mislabeling event is wrong, when that mislabeling event occurs, innocent people get pulled into the ambit of the system. And there are three primary triggers that I identified in my research. The first is forensic mislabeling or error in event as a crime. And we saw that with Rodriguez-Crawford, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about other examples. The second is a false accusation that a crime occurred when it didn't. And there I told you about the false accusation brought against the dad in a very bitter divorce dispute. But that's another example of how no crime wrongful convictions occur. A false accusation is made, somebody credits that false accusation, and then the system just kicks in and someone gets convicted. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about the police and their role in triggering no crime wrongful convictions. Whether it's actual overt misconduct or whether it's just overly aggressive and biased policing practices, which I think Doug mentioned at the start of this conversation. So let's talk a little bit more about forensic error. Again, we saw one example in Rodriguez-Crawford. I always feel like I need to bring up Cameron Todd Willingham. Many of you may be familiar with his name. He was executed in Texas back in 2004 for the arson murder of his 3 children. And what is astonishing is that all of the fire experts who looked back at his case said this was an accidental fire. And Cameron Todd Willingham himself insisted from the moment of the fire until the last breath that he took before he was executed that he in fact was innocent. But the arson investigator who worked on his case saw arson instead of accident. And that triggered a whole process that led to his death. And Willingham is not the only defendant who has been wrongly convicted of arson murder based on bad fire science. 3 men, William Vasquez, Amaury Villalobos, and Raymond Mora, were just exonerated in Brooklyn after they served over 30-something years in prison. Mora actually died in prison before he was exonerated. He was exonerated posthumously. And one of the men lost their eyesight in prison because of glaucoma that wasn't treated. And again, when fire experts today looked back on their case, they realized it was an electrical fire. Hadn't been set deliberately at all. Other examples, though, outside of the arson case, a suicide could be mislabeled a homicide. You know, in the popular depiction of suicide, people leave a note, but people often don't leave a note. And sometimes suicides are mislabeled as intentional murders. Sometimes a living person emerges from the dead. One of the first known wrongful conviction cases is actually a no crime wrongful conviction. These brothers were charged with murdering their missing brother-in-law. And right as one of the brothers was being dragged to the gallows, it was revealed that the missing brother-in-law had just skipped town and was alive and well in New Jersey. Sometimes we see infant deaths as being mislabeled shaken baby syndrome. Shaken baby syndrome has been in the news quite a bit, but one of the things about shaken baby syndrome is it's been discredited as a theory of death, because the amount of force that a person would have to use is sort of typically not present without other symptoms. And so we see a number of people who have been incarcerated and sentenced to sentences like life without parole, and even one woman who was sentenced to death under a misdiagnosis. And the Choctaw 3, which is another famous wrongful conviction, involved 3 people who were intellectually disabled, who were wrongly convicted of murdering a baby that was never even conceived. I'll let you think about that. If you want more details, I can explain it. But how does this happen? A lot of it has to do with cognitive biases. Somebody jumps in and says this was a crime, and everyone follows suit instead of taking an objective step back and cross-checking that. Was this really a crime? And then I told you a little bit about false accusations, so I'm not going to spend, in the interest of time, I won't go over that in too much detail. But again, it's this notion that somebody, for whatever reason, whether it's because of a divorce or custody battle, or whether it's revenge or retaliation or for financial benefits. There was a documentary just released about Brian Banks, who was a high school football player who had amazing football prospects. The NFL was already looking at him. He had gotten a college scholarship, and he was accused of rape. And he wound up pleading guilty because his lawyer advised him to. And the girl who made the accusation had made this accusation to cover up some other things, but ultimately didn't want to come forward because her family had been awarded a lot of money because the alleged rape that never happened was supposed to have taken place in the school district. And so financial motivations can also be a reason why people bring false accusations or sort of stick to their guns about them. And then there's police misconduct, where the police actually affirmatively plant evidence or engage in outright lies or misconduct in order to create the fiction that a crime occurred when none did. And here I thought I'd bring something up that's close to home for you, the Baltimore Gun Trace Task Force. The name, as it sounds, there's an elite task force that was designed to take guns off the streets of Baltimore. And some of you may know about this case, but in fact, what happened is the police wound up plundering the city and its residents, taking thousands of dollars in jewelry and cash and drugs, and taking drugs that they found illegally and then reselling them on the street. They robbed people. They actually carried with them toy guns so that in the event that there was an unlawful shooting, they would have a cover story. And one crazy story that resulted in a no crime wrongful conviction involved a man named Umar Burley. And Umar Burley was in his car with his cousin, and he was approached by a band of masked people with their guns blazing. And Burley, thinking he was about to be robbed, took off and unfortunately crashed into another car and killed a civilian. The police were the people who were wearing the masks, and they had intended, in fact, to rob Burley. And when they saw what happened and that Burley had killed somebody in an attempt to get away from these masked men, the police planted tons of heroin in his trunk. And when he wound up also pleading guilty because he had a prior criminal record and knew that if he went to trial and it was his word against the word of officers, he was afraid he would lose. And so he took a plea and he spent quite a bit of time in prison. But when the Baltimore Gun Trace Task Force scandal was finally revealed and an officer came forward and started sort of spilling the beans about all the misconduct they had engaged in, Umar Burley's story was part of his confession, and his conviction was eventually overturned and he was exonerated. Baltimore, as I think it was Doug who mentioned it earlier, has a notorious history of, at the low end too, in cases like loitering, taking especially young African-American people off the street, arresting them for low-level offenses that they did not commit. Often those cases would get dismissed because there was no factual basis for them. Otherwise, people sometimes plead guilty just to get home. And we'll talk about that just in a few minutes. But Baltimore does, but it's not just Baltimore, right? In Chicago, there was this shakedown scheme where police who were tasked with keeping low-income housing projects safe would go and actually demand payments from residents. And residents who didn't pay, poor people who were living in subsidized housing who didn't pay the demands of these officers, would often find themselves charged with possessing drugs that the police planted on them. But of course, it's not just Chicago, it's Philadelphia, it's LA, it's different cities in Texas, it's all over the country. So these happen and they result in no crime convictions. But sometimes it's not just sort of deliberate, overt criminal behavior by police officers. Sometimes it's just engagement set out by aggressive policing policies that results in the arrest of a whole host of people who then wind up pleading guilty so they can just get on with their lives and go home. And one great example of this, and I don't mean great in a good way, but one really clear example of this is the New York City Trespass Affidavit program that took place in the 90s. There was a huge lawsuit about this, and eventually the program has been ended. But what was happening is the police would go into, again, low-income housing projects and arrest people for trespass. And it didn't seem to matter that the people actually lived in the building, which of course is not trespass, or were visiting people, were invited guests of people who lived in the building, which is not trespass. From 2006 to 2010, about 95% of the people who were stopped for trespassing were Black and Latino. And there was another study, about 30% of residents who lived in one particular project had been charged with trespassing, so they've been arrested and charged despite the fact they lived there. And it was this huge scandal. But what was even worse about it is that all these people would get arrested for trespassing and they would get booked. They would be fingerprinted, their photos would be taken, they would be put in the holding cell, sometimes overnight, before they were brought before a judge for these misdemeanor trespass cases. And people time and again would plead guilty. I saw this firsthand. I was a public defender here in the Bronx, and this is part of where this program was rolled out. And I would beg my clients, I'd say, please, if you would just come to court, back to court, I will get this case dismissed for you. This is crazy. But they couldn't all that often. They had childcare responsibilities or work they had to get to, or they just didn't want to experience the time and inconvenience of having to go through the security line in the courthouse and spend the day waiting for their case to be called, often multiple times over the course of a month or 2 months or 6 months, just to get a trespass case dismissed. And so they would wind up with a misdemeanor on their record. And that matters. There's It just hit yesterday, so I haven't had a chance to fully go through all the data, but the Brennan Center just issued a report talking about the dampening effect on income of misdemeanor convictions on a person's record, and it's significant. So in the context of misdemeanors, we see no crime cases. And, you know, so I talked about serious cases, and I also want to highlight again. So here, this is a picture of resisting arrest. 80% of people in criminal courts are involved in misdemeanors, which is why I keep bringing it up. They just don't get the attention I think that they deserve. But there's a story about a guy named Wassily Gregory, who was in Alaska, and he was walking home one night, and out of nowhere, a cop kind of approaches him. The next thing you know, Wassily Gregory's on the ground, and then he gets arrested for resisting arrest. And Gregory goes to court, and he pleads guilty, and he goes home. And frankly, we never should have known about this case. This is just the typical run-of-the-mill case that happens, and often just flies under the radar entirely. Well, in this case, there happened to be an academic researcher in this town in Alaska who was just visiting, who saw the whole thing, and she was so outraged that she went to the police precinct and she insisted that a report be filed and that this case be investigated. And as a result of that investigation, they uncovered a security camera, which had captured the entire incident on film. Sure enough, Wassily Gregory had not been resisting arrest. He had done nothing at all. The police officer had a prior beef with him and just beat him up, and then claimed it was resisting arrest to cover up his own brutality. That happens. That happens more than it ought to. So whether it's the loitering that we see, and I talk about in the book, the loitering case in Baltimore, whether we see resisting arrest in Alaska or elsewhere, or low-level arrest for marijuana cases where, again, the police are just planting drugs on people who they think are suspicious or who they thought were disrespectful or whatever the context is. We see these happening a lot in the misdemeanor context, but we don't know just how frequently they occur. So what's going on here? If these are the triggers and if this is the context, how do these things happen? And so I want to start with the prosecutors. Prosecutors are incredibly powerful. They're the people who get to decide whether charges are brought and which charges are going to be brought. And they're supposed to be ministers of justice. And yet so often we see that prosecutors are all over these no crime cases, whether it's when the police make an arrest for nothing. The prosecutors are supposed to vet that accusation, but they don't. They often rubber stamp police arrests, which gives an imprimatur of officiality to these arrests and often makes it seem as though a crime in fact occurred. When they look at the evidence that's presented to them and they realize, oh my gosh, we don't have a strong case because nothing happened here. Instead of dismissing the case, some prosecutors make a plea offer. And if that plea offer is accepted, which it often is, 95% of all criminal cases are resolved by guilty plea. So if somebody accepts a plea, we never learn about the evidentiary weaknesses or the fact that there was no crime committed. And we don't learn about the police misconduct or the prosecutor's misconduct in joining the police. We just don't know about it because the plea bargain hides all of it. Prosecutors also have a constitutional obligation to turn over exculpatory evidence to the defense, meaning evidence that, let's say in an eyewitness case, that somebody else said, no, that wasn't the defendant. The defendant was 6 feet tall and white, and you've arrested a 5'6" black man. But they often don't turn over the evidence that they're required to. Brady by the National Registry of Exonerations also issued a report a couple of weeks ago talking about the scope of prosecutorial misconduct, and Brady violations are a huge part of what they don't do. Prosecutors don't turn over the evidence they are required to by the Constitution. Sometimes they use unreliable forensic evidence that just does not pass muster. They'll bring it in and roll it out anyway, or they'll call a jailhouse informant or someone who they know has everything to gain by lying and nothing to lose, and they'll act as though they're the most credible witnesses on the block and not share the information that they're supposed to share about why this person might have an incentive to lie. And then there's this crazy thing where even after a conviction occurs and compelling evidence of innocence emerges, they stick to their guns. And I'll give you a very short example. Gerald Davis and his father were convicted of committing a rape. And it turns out later that the rape did not occur, but they examined after the fact, after their conviction happened after they were in prison. And they went back, some lawyers went back and tested what the prosecution was claiming was the DNA evidence. It turns out, of course, that Gerald Davis's DNA was nowhere to be found. And when presented with that evidence, instead of saying, oh, we really messed this up, the prosecutor retried Gerald Davis, but this time under a theory that he had committed the rape but didn't ejaculate. He was acquitted by a jury, and but not until they had both, he and his father had spent 8 years. And one of the reasons prosecutors can do this is because they have absolute immunity. Now, the idea of immunity has suddenly sort of joined the mainstream media, right? Because the police have qualified immunity, and we've been talking a lot in the media generally about the police and the ability to hold them accountable. And one of the obstacles to that is qualified immunity and how courts interpret that standard. But what most people don't know, and what's not part of the conversation, is that prosecutors have absolute immunity for any actions that they engaged in the course of their official duties as a prosecutor. People are astonished to learn that, but it's true. And so prosecutors can act with impunity because they won't be held responsible. But it's not just prosecutors. If you look through the wrongful conviction literature, judges often get a pass as well. And I don't think that's really deserved. Judges are people. They, in many jurisdictions, are elected. And so when they are doing their jobs, instead of being objective and fair and impartial and considering the evidence before them, they're playing to a second audience, the electorate. And that can create all kinds of tough-on-crime decisions that aren't warranted. Some judges are overtly bigoted in the courtroom or have implicit biases that they haven't explored that come out in their decisions. And many are former prosecutors who haven't quite shaken off that robe of seeking convictions and presuming guilt, when in fact there's compelling evidence to the contrary. But that's not the only way judges don't do what they're supposed to do. They are the gatekeepers in the courtroom, and they are supposed to exclude evidence that isn't accurate and reliable. And yet here's a picture of bite mark evidence. Here's an ad for a judge in Wisconsin who was voted off the Supreme Court after a whole series of ads accusing him of being soft on crime or friendly to defendants. And here's a picture of bite mark evidence. There are forensic odontologists who've been claiming that they can match a bite mark on a victim's skin to a person's teeth marks, teeth patterns. That is 100% junk science, and yet judges allow it in. Even today, when we know it's junk science, it's still making its way into courtrooms. Judges ignore sleeping lawyers, drunk lawyers, unprepared lawyers, bad lawyers. They ignore prosecutorial misconduct instead of calling it out. They accept pleas when there's no factual basis for the plea. And then they participate in what's called the trial penalty. So if someone refuses a guilty plea and says, I want to take my day in court, the judge will slam them with an incredibly long sentence. And we saw that in Tulia, Texas, where a white officer named Tom Coleman had been brought in to stop a drug problem that no one knew existed in Tulia, Texas. Coleman arrested something like 10% of the Black population in Tulia, Texas. And when the first few defendants went to trial saying there were no drugs, I don't even know what he's talking about, they were convicted and sentenced to such stunningly long terms of imprisonment that all the rest of the 48 Tulia defendants pled guilty. And eventually everyone was exonerated because Tom Coleman had been lying the whole time. Defense lawyers also play a really important role. Public defenders' offices in particular are often understaffed, they're underfunded, their caseloads are too high. I am a former public defender, but there can be in certain offices a meet 'em and plead 'em culture because there's just so many cases. And some lawyers are assigned to the same courtroom with the same judge over and over again, and they feel like if they work too hard for one client, they may be hurting another client. And of course, that should never be a choice that a criminal defense lawyer has to face. They have to zealously represent each client. And sometimes they're just bad lawyers, right? They're unmotivated, or they're untrained, or they're drunk. But even really great lawyers, even really committed lawyers, bump up against a lack of funding for investigators, a lack of funding for experts. And frankly, there's also the issue of official misconduct. When the prosecutors and the police are hiding evidence or putting on lies as truths, defense lawyers can't really do much with that. They can't attack what they don't know. Okay, so I'm going to go through this a little bit quickly because I see it's about 9:30 and I do want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions and answers. But what do we do? And there are a couple of really concrete things we can do. And in the area of forensic misconduct, which is how I started this conversation in the first place, we can require forensic independence. So often, forensic scientists view themselves as part of the prosecutor's team, or they're physically housed in the same building as the police. We need to have complete separation so that scientists can do their objective job and not take sides. And we also need to have national certification of forensic labs and scientists. That was all happening under President Obama. He had created a national forensic science task force, which was disbanded when President Trump took office. Jeff Sessions came in and shut it all down. But we can revisit that. We can create, when medical personnel come up with a diagnosis of a crime, they should have devil's advocacy panels that come back in and say, okay, so you think this looks suspicious. What are some of the other possible causes? We found that just playing devil's advocate with one or two other people can really open up the conversation and not keep it focused on this tunnel vision that so often creates no crime, wrongful convictions. But in the context of prosecutors, we can demand open file discovery so that there is no hiding of evidence. And we can hold prosecutors accountable by eliminating absolute immunity. We can increase funding for defenders, increase access to experts, provide better training for criminal justice actors. At the low end, we can create bail reforms so that people are less inclined to take pleas and more inclined to fight their cases. And then finally, if we created policies that decriminalize certain behaviors, we might actually free up resources to do a better job of actually going after real crimes and people who commit. So that's where I'll stop. I'd love to take some questions, but if you have any other questions for me, you can email me at henryj@montclair.edu. I put my website on this slide as well. And you can sort of come and visit me there and we can continue the conversation there. But I'm available for questions.
Wow, Jessica, this is Perry. I don't know if y'all can see me, it doesn't matter, but.
Oh, I can stop sharing, would you like me to?
Well, I don't, whatever. I've got so many questions before and I was taking notes. So I've just kind of, this whole topic so overwhelms me. When I saw the book, information about the book, I thought it would just be so perfect for this audience because Leadership Greater Washington and a wider circle are working on these exact issues in our community. And I mean, who knew you could go to jail or get executed for a crime that didn't even happen? In the news, obviously right now, you can get murdered for a crime that did not happen. That's clearly taking up a lot of time. I was gratified to see the Breonna Taylor award yesterday and some changes happening in the Louisville police force. So many questions. I'm going to get to everybody else's, but I was really taken with the last page of your book. I was reading last night. I just wanted to read it because it struck me as quite poignant. All have lost so much to the criminal justice system, even though no crime ever occurred. What a colossal waste of time, of energy and resources, and of human spirit. And that just so touched me that it's the loss of human spirit in this. It's really hard to say what I feel about that, but I'm going to go to the Q&A for our amazing audience and see what they have to say. We have a question that we have seen newly elected prosecutors elected in Northern Virginia promising a new view as to what to prosecute. Is this happening in other parts of the country, or are the quote law and order prosecutors typically elected? What is the percentage of elected prosecutors versus appointed? That's a good question. Thank you, Anonymous.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I don't have that data at my fingertips, but I can tell you that there has been a whole host of progressive prosecutors that have been swept into office. You know, George Soros made that one of his priorities. And so he's been funding the election hopes of progressive prosecutors. And so in Philadelphia, Larry Krasner was elected. In Chicago, I'm forgetting her first name, last name Fox, another progressive prosecutor. In Texas, believe it or not, there's a former public defender who's got emblazoned on his chest something about like presumed innocent or something. He was elected prosecutor. San Francisco elected an incredibly progressive prosecutor. And so while it's still early days, we don't know how effective overall it's been. You know, when a prosecutor says, we are no longer going to be prosecuting marijuana, loitering, trespassing, whatever it is, that actually has a tremendous impact at the low end of the system. And or bail reform is another thing. When prosecutors get on board with the idea of bail reform, it makes a tremendous difference because it keeps poor people who are not at risk of flight and not at risk of harming anyone else in the community. It keeps them in their family structure, in their employment structure. And we know that there's a direct connection between employment and crime. So it's such an important thing to focus in on, this idea of electing prosecutors. So often we just check without knowing, but if you have an elected prosecutor in your jurisdiction, that is one person to get behind if you really want to make a difference in criminal justice reform, because it matters.
It's also a demographic thing too. I worked with Angela J. Davis, who's a professor at American University, you may know, and she was encouraging African Americans to run for that office because there's a disproportionate number of Caucasian prosecutors, is my understanding. I mean,
yes, that's right. I mean, you know, and men. It's mostly men and it's mostly white men. So yeah, I mean, being able to bring in a broader perspective is very powerful. But just the idea that you've got prosecutors running wherever they're running in the state, saying, I want to decriminalize certain offenses, or I don't want to have bail be a thing that causes poor people to plead guilty. That is a seismic shift. And even getting that messaging out, and does it work everywhere? No, but it is working in some jurisdictions, and we are seeing a difference, and that will help set policy agendas. So it's very impactful.
good. Caitlin Mayo asks, what reforms specific to the police could help prevent no crime wrongful convictions?
Excellent question, and it's complex. I mean, one of the things I love about this whole subject is everything relates to everything else, right? It really is an indictment of the entire criminal justice system. But specifically with policing, one of the things that I often talk about is that from the moment a young cadet is brought into that police academy, they are trained that their loyalty belongs to their brothers and sisters, and that no matter what happens, that's where your priority lies. And we need to see a shift in that training so that they understand that their loyalty lies to the communities that they serve. And that being a good police officer and that being a loyal police officer means calling out misconduct when it occurs among their fellow officers. Right now, in so many jurisdictions, if a young officer says, this person's engaging in behavior that's not acceptable, they are often retaliated against by the folks at the top. So if training occurs that changes at the bottom, it needs to be embraced and reinforced at the top, as opposed to, so an officer who calls out misconduct should be rewarded and commended, not punished and denied overtime and given bad shifts. And there is some programming, in fact, in Baltimore. Baltimore is really happening. So in Louisiana, there was a program that was piloted called EPIC, EPIC, Ethical Policing is Courageous. And the person who ran that EPIC program, who piloted that, brought it to Baltimore. And so Baltimore is another city that's been exploring whether or not EPIC, which encourages officers to sort of call each other out for misconduct and to report when it's happening. That's another sort of programming piece that could really make a difference. So that's two examples. I think we need to really focus in on policies that over-target and overly aggressively target for communities, and particular communities of color. That would make a big difference. And I think in tandem, these are things that matter. So that's just a few suggestions.
I thought that EPIC was interesting. I was going to bring that up for y'all
Yeah.
who don't know about it. I hope that can spread.
Yeah, well, it's being piloted in a number of cities, not just in
Right.
Baltimore, not just in New Orleans, but around the country. Yeah.
Rasheen Rook asks, what are the concrete and or intangible benefits for either wrongfully convicting someone or convicting a person for a crime that hasn't taken place? Who actually wins in these scenarios and what are the wins? Good question. Thank you, Rasheen.
So in my humble opinion, nobody wins, right? Nobody wins at all. And in fact, it's a fascinating thing because if we take a step back, right, in all criminal cases, not in wrongful, in all criminal cases, the prosecution has to prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt. That's the standard. It's a pretty high standard. But beyond a reasonable doubt does not mean beyond all doubt, meaning we allow for the possibility of error in our criminal justice system. And we are awful about correcting that error. Our appellate process really does not do well with saying, okay, there was a factual mistake at trial. We need to repair this or make it whole. But what I find so awful about no crime, so in the case of a wrongful conviction where an actual crime occurred, you can say, okay, that's so terrible for the person who's wrongly convicted. I get how it happened because there's that possibility of error. And society is harmed because the guilty person has gone free, right? But in the case of a no crime wrongful conviction, nobody benefits. It's impossible to understand everything I just said about, okay, I kind of get it. It's really terrible. It's guilty person. Where is the benefit to society in prosecuting cases that didn't occur? There is none. We literally spend so much time and resources investigating and arresting and prosecuting and convicting and then incarcerating people. It's absolutely mind-blowing. But I think what happens is people get caught up, and when I say people, I mean the police and then the prosecutors get really caught up in this idea that a crime did occur. And if the crime occurred, they have to do their jobs. They have to get that conviction. And even though prosecutors are supposed to be ministers of justice and they're supposed to do justice, that often gets confused with getting convictions. There are prosecutor offices that actually keep track of people's wins, meaning how many convictions they got, versus how many people they actually correctly convicted or how many people they accurately dismissed cases against because there was no evidence. So I don't think anyone really wins, but I guess if you believe a crime was committed, then getting the conviction is what you're supposed to do.
But you wonder how many of them really even believe. I mean, they might be fooling themselves, but that's another conversation.
And a lot, at the low end, they don't even know. Prosecutors don't even know whether somebody was trespassing or not. They're willing to take that plea and move it along.
That's exactly. Celeste James asks, what are some of the organizations that are working on these specific structural solutions? Is anyone working on the immunity issue, for example?
So there's lots of organizations who are doing lots of great work. I mentioned the Brennan Center because they're on my brain because I issued a really interesting report that I just haven't had a chance to look at. But the ACLU does great work. There are defender organizations like the Bronx Defenders, where I used to work, full disclosure, but they do amazing, amazing community and holistic based defense work. There are, in response to the fact that like New Jersey has amazing bail reform. New York just implemented bail reform, but lots of places don't have that. And there's bail funds now it's a really brand new idea where, not super brand new, but it's relatively new, where people are actually donating a bail fund so that people can come in and get poor folks who are just sitting in jail waiting for their day in court out. So that's really, really impactful. The Innocence Project obviously does incredible work around wrongful convictions, particularly and almost exclusively in cases involving DNA, but they're also advocacy. They have an advocacy wing and they do a lot of work on the ground trying to change state and national policies to make a difference. So those are just some of the organizations. I feel like there's part 2 to your question and I apologize. I think that was.
Yeah, she was particularly asking about immunity, but how much of this could come from DOJ at the federal level, like from the Attorney General? I mean, could it initiate here in DC and then seep down? Is that another option?
Some of it, I mean, listen, policing in general, criminal justice in general, mostly takes place in the states. But going back to the example of forensics, which in the no crime context is quite significant, the idea of creating a national standard for independent labs and for scientists who work in them could have been huge, because it would have set out these standards at the top level and trickled down, so that when somebody's trying to, bring in some kind of matching evidence, for instance, the National Academy of Sciences issued a report in 2009, and then there was a presidential report that came out a number of years later, sort of said, like, all these ideas that we can match people to things are pretty bad. Except for DNA, they really don't work. You really can't conclusively match a footprint to somebody's foot. It just doesn't really work that way. And so that's one example where there was going to be federal leadership, and it would have made a significant difference, and it didn't. I know Joe Biden, if you look at his justice platform, one of the things he talks about is decriminalizing marijuana, and moving it from a schedule where it is on the schedule to something where researchers can actually look into the efficacy of marijuana as a medical treatment, et cetera. That would be significant, because then states who were interested in legalizing marijuana wouldn't be afraid of being in conflict with the federal law that continues to make it illegal. So yeah, there are significant things, opportunities for the federal government, I think, to make a big difference, to lead the way if it were so inclined.
So voting matters. Mahan asks, what countries internationally and what cities in the US are furthest along in reforming the system and can be looked at as leaders and potential benchmarks? That's a good one. Thank you, Mahan.
So I don't mean to toot my own state's horn, but I'm in New Jersey, and New Jersey, believe it or not, is actually a leader in a lot of things that cause wrongful, not a lot of things that cause wrongful convictions, but in addressing things that cause wrongful convictions. And so, for instance, New Jersey requires the recording of all interrogations from start to finish. That's very impactful, because oftentimes what happens in cases is you see the confession, but you don't see any of the questioning that led up to it. New Jersey records the whole thing and makes it available. There are recommendations around identification procedures. One of the issues that comes up with identification procedures is that the police are often very suggestive. New Jersey has implemented a whole host of changes to the way that we do identifications here. And it's been incredibly impactful and is a model for other states. Then there's the issue of compensation. So places like Texas and Kansas, believe it or not, do a great job of compensating people who've been wrongly convicted and exonerated. Some states don't even have compensation statutes at all, meaning a person will be released and have no recourse at all, even if they've spent decades in prison. So that is something, there are model statutes. The federal government actually has a really great model statute that can be replicated. So I think it depends on the area that we're talking about in terms of where you want to see change, who's the model. And the other thing to keep in mind internationally, we have an accusatorial system of justice where we have a prosecutor and we have a defense lawyer and the judge is the neutral magistrate, and we kind of duke it out. That isn't actually the case. In most of Europe, there's an inquisitorial model, which is very different, and they investigate cases very differently, which raises its own set of issues. So it's hard to compare apples and oranges. But there are innocence-related projects all around the country, because it certainly is not unique to the United States. Although what is unique to the United States is the size and scope of our criminal justice system. We are the world's leaders in terms of incarceration, both in terms of pure numbers and on a per capita basis. We lead the world in how many people we have in our jails and prisons.
People are making money on that, I think, right? June Kress asked, did the administration's criminal justice reform bill contain anything that addressed prosecutorial misconduct or overreach or anything related to implicit bias? Good question.
So I don't know about the last part of the question, the implicit bias training, which I have to tell you, the studies are very mixed about the outcomes on implicit bias training. And I think standing alone, it's probably not sufficient to make a big difference. I think it needs to be, I even talk about it in the book as like something that can be very helpful, but only if it's sort of accompanied by a real commitment at the top and at the bottom and all the way around to changing the way things are done. But in terms of holding prosecutors accountable, no. Most people are not focused on that. Even in all the conversations that we're having about criminal justice reform, the police are sort of at the front and center of these calls for reform with obvious reason. But it does sort of insulate the prosecutor from further conversation. And the Supreme Court has, it has affirmed again and again this idea of absolute immunity for prosecutors, which I think is kind of mind-boggling. Like, the police aren't even held to absolute immunity standards. Surgeons don't have absolute immunity. Why are we giving prosecutors absolute immunity? And how does that impact what they do? And is there a different standard? We don't want to hold people willy-nilly responsible for things that they couldn't, that accidentally or unintentionally occurred. But isn't there a way to sort of say, like, what you did was intentional and wrong, and someone lost 20 years of their lives for it? We want to hold you responsible. So no, absolute immunity and prosecutorial reform, as far as I know, was not in the most recent reform.
Wow. I have a 10 o'clock and need to hop off. I'm going to let Mark take it over. But Jessica, this is such an important topic. Thank you for writing the book. Thank you for spending your morning with us. It definitely raises more questions than answers. And I am really grateful for your time. And I'm going to turn it over to my good friend, Mark Burgell, to close out. I think that's the end of the questions. And I look forward to staying in touch and hopefully maybe getting some more interesting book events for you so this word can keep getting out.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate this.
Yes. Good luck to you, and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Perry. Really great. We still have some people on. They're not cascading off yet. Jessica, I don't know if you want to have any closing comment before I thank the LGW folks. Is there anything else you want to add as kind of a goodbye and to the team?
No, I mean, the only thing, first of all, thank you again for having me, and thank you all for coming. But I do think this subject gives us an opportunity to have a conversation that levels the playing ground in terms of political affiliations or worldviews, because I think we all can get on board with the idea that it is 100% unnecessary and harmful to incarcerate people or to convict people for crimes that never happen. And that's something we can all agree on. And if that's the case, that gives us a platform to start thinking about, well, what changes can we make? So I feel like in some ways, as terrible of a subject as it is, it does provide us a positive pathway forward. And so I thank everyone for their attention and for thinking about these issues. I think there are meaningful ways we can make a difference.
What a great closing thought, Jessica. Anything, right, that can bring us together at this time is really special. So I appreciate your perspective on that, all your passion and research. I know you have to say the same things over and over again when you do something like this, and we really appreciate you bringing such passion to this morning. We have a lot of folks still on, so while they're still on, Chase, I want to thank you. As always, you do the technical side so beautifully, so we love your work, Chase, and Debbie and Doug. Thank you as well for the great work of Leadership Greater Washington during this pandemic and everything else that's happening. So thank you all for coming. I wish you a great day. Jessica, good luck with everything with the book. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much again for having me. I really appreciate it, and for all your good work.
All right. All right, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you.